Look,
I told him I have to get back to him.
look, we've been over this before. Playing on a school team is just going to take time away from spiritual activities. Plus, think of the bad association.
But I'm not a child anymore. I think I can make it work. Can I at least try it?
Definitely not. And I don't have time to debate this with you.
To carry water to his family's home. You see, he says we're not allowed to use the taps in the village that the upper castes use. He explains when he was in school, Rajesh and his friends couldn't even touch the football that the other children play soccer with. They played with stones instead. Now in Africa, a prejudice and division is not based on the color of your skin, but it may be based on the tribe or the village that you are born in or live in. A young man named Stanley from West Africa says, I first learned about prejudice at the age of 16. Total strangers told me to get out of town. Some people from my tribe had their houses burned down. My father's bank account was frozen. As a result, I began to hate the tribe that was discriminating against us. Similarly, in Asia, deep divisions exist between some who are born in Korea versus some who are born in Japan, or versus some who are born in China or other countries in Asia. In Europe, countries that neighbor each other have deep and simmering hatred for each other, such as ones living in Italy versus Romania, Croatia and Serbia, Czech Republic and Slovakia, and the list goes on and on. Well, what's the point? Well, the point is that Satan has crafted a world in which any difference whatsoever, the color of our skin, our language, the country we're born in, the side of the tracks that we're from, any difference whatsoever is used to create divisions and suspicion and hate. The very opposite of what Jehovah stands for. So what's the challenge for us? Well, the challenge is that we live in that world, and we're influenced from that world. And due to the movements of people all around the world, our congregations are full of brothers and sisters and ones from different cultures and languages and places of the world. And if we're not careful, we can begin to be influenced and begin to think like this divided world. And that's exactly what Satan would like to see happen. See, Satan would love to see our congregations fall apart and begin to have infighting and divisions because of all the things that we're seeing going on in the world. But we know that's never going to happen. Why? Well, because we do not give up in fulfilling the law of Christ. And how we do that brings great joy to Jehovah's name. So how do we go about loving one another just as Jesus loved us in this divided world? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this discussion. And to do so, we're going to consider 4 key points. The first is why or how did Jesus teach a better way? Number 2, we're going to consider what we can learn from the first century congregation and how they overcame their differences when they arose. 3, we're going to consider how humility is needed if we're going to love one another in the congregation. And finally, number 4, what formula can help us to fulfill the law of Christ in our congregation? So let's start with our first point. How did Jesus teach a better way? Now, first up, we have to ask, well, was there prejudice and discrimination in Jesus' day? Well, absolutely. Prejudice and discrimination was rampant in Jesus' day. Remember, the Jews, they had no dealings with the Samaritans. Religious leaders looked down on the common people. They called them an accursed people. And sinners and tax collectors, they were viewed as with contempt. In fact, many would not even consider eating or being around such ones. Well, Jesus grew up in that environment. He grew up in an environment where different was viewed with contempt. But now, did Jesus allow himself to be influenced by that environment? No, not at all. He viewed matters in a completely different light. In fact, how did Jesus feel about ones who promoted differences and who promoted divisions? Did he secretly share their thinking? Can we picture Jesus maybe with his disciples when they're all alone, maybe joking about ones of other classes or other races? No. Jesus' position was very clear. In fact, turn, if you will, to Luke chapter 18. And notice the illustration that he gave and who it was directed to. Luke chapter 18, look at verse 9. Luke 18 and verse 9. He says, he also told this illustration to some who trusted in their own righteousness and considered others as nothing. And now you remember, if you read on, that's the illustration he gave of the Pharisee and the tax collector both going to pray at the temple, and how this Pharisee was so self-righteous and praying to God, how he was so glad he wasn't like this lowly tax collector. But now, did you notice who the illustration was directed to? He says, to some who were considered others as nothing. And then he called out the Pharisees in that illustration. You see, Jesus disdained those who had a self-righteous attitude and looked down on others. And Jesus refused to let himself be influenced by the thinking of the day. He taught us a better way. Notice what it says in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36. When Jesus looked at people, what did he see? Matthew chapter 9 and verse 36. It says, on seeing the crowds, he felt pity for them, because they were skinned and thrown about like sheep without a shepherd. So when Jesus looked at people, what did he see? Did he see the color of their skin? Did he see the language they spoke, what country they were born in? No, he saw people who needed help. He saw people who were lowly and needed his help. He felt pity for them. Look over in John chapter 12 and verse 32 and see what it says there. John chapter 12 and verse 32. And here Jesus says, and yet I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all sorts of men. No discrimination, but the Greek-speaking widows were just a little bit oversensitive, and something happened and it kind of blew out of proportion. We don't know. But what we do know is how the apostles dealt with the situation. They set a beautiful example in love. You read the account, we find they immediately took steps to address it. In chapter 6 and verse 3, they called this a necessary matter that had to be corrected. They chose 7 experienced brothers to take the lead in the distribution, all of them having Greek names. Why? Well, maybe this would make it more palatable to these Greek-speaking widows. They would see that the brothers took their concern seriously. And see, the apostles did not allow this potentially explosive issue to divide the congregation. And it's of interest that nowhere do we hear this situation raising up again in the congregation. Another account that had the potential to be divisive. Look at Acts chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Acts 11, 1 through 3, it says, now the apostles and the brothers who were in Judea heard that people of the nations had also accepted the word of God. So when Peter came up to Jerusalem, the supporters of circumcision began to criticize him, saying, you went into the house of men who were not circumcised and ate with them. See, they were getting after Peter for associating with and eating with uncircumcised men from other nations. How would Peter react? See, would his words fuel the feelings that there should be segregation in the congregation between the Jews and the Gentiles? Do we read that Peter goes, well, you know, listen, I didn't want to do it either, but this angel came and I didn't have a choice, and so I did it against my will. Or do you think he began to make a joke about his time with the noisy Italians or the strange food that they ate there? I'm Italian, I can say the strange food that they ate. No, he didn't do that. Look at what it says in verse 4. It says that this Peter went on to explain the matter in detail. And look at the result. If you go down to verse 18. It says, when they heard these things, they stopped objecting, and they glorified God, saying, "So then God has also granted to people of the nations repentance leading to life." So what's the point? The point is that sometimes difficulties did arise in the early congregation between ones of differing backgrounds. And thus it became necessary to provide guidance to help them that they could strengthen their bonds of love. See, the congregation had to be reminded of how Jehovah and Jesus views others and views people of all the nations. Beautiful, beautiful oasis in this hate-filled and divisive world. May we never, ever take that for granted. May we do everything we can to maintain that spirit in the congregation. But we're only human, and we're imperfect, and we have to continue to work at it. You see, experiencing impartiality and brotherly love may be unfamiliar for new ones coming into the congregation. So we may need to help them to adapt to this unique environment of love and impartiality. See, rather than being suspicious, new ones need to learn to trust that their fellow believers really do love Jehovah, want what's best, that we all have good motives. And when there are misunderstandings, what do we have to do? Well, as in the first century, we need to work it out. When there's misunderstandings, the first thing we reach for should not be hate and suspicion of our brothers. We don't automatically assume that we're undergoing some unfair treatment or something going wrong because of our race or economic status or educational background. And then what do we do when problems do arise? See, just like in the first century congregation, when maybe something does arise because of our backgrounds, we need to work through it and ensure that our congregations are characterized by unity and impartiality. In fact, turn please, if you will, to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. It provides counsel to the first century congregation that we strive to have in our congregation. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 25 and 26. It says, "So that there should be no division in the body, but its members should have mutual concern for one another. If one member suffers, all the other members suffer. Or if a member is glorified, all the other members rejoice with him." See, what a beautiful spirit. No divisions, in unity. When one is hurting, we all hurt. When one is happy, we're all happy. Is that the spirit that we have in our congregation? You can imagine how beautiful that is. The ones who formerly were in churches or religions where they were fed up with the gossip and the backbiting and the grudges and jealousy, and they come to the congregation and see the beautiful spirit of love that's characterized by our congregations. May we never take for granted that beautiful spirit. May we do everything we can to support it, because brothers and sisters, we have to remember, we've heard over and over again, we need our congregations. When there are natural disasters like we've seen, even in this country, here in Texas and in Florida and in the Caribbean, our congregations are the source and where we get our support from one another. We need to have a serious health problem and need assistance, or a death in our family, or just want to lay down and not get up. And see, that's the beauty of our congregation. We're all connected to one another. And when one falls, we respond and we help them back up again. And see, like on that trip, it's the responsibility of each one of the persons on that row to help the person that's next to them. See, now, as we know, the elders have a weightier assignment. Well, all of us have the commission to help our brothers. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Picture you're going up the mountain, and the second person from the end slips and goes into a ravine. Does the group stop, wait for the guy all the way to the front and hook himself from all the way down? No, the two people right next to him grabs him, lifts him out, and they keep going again. Well, see, likewise, it's a responsibility of each one of us in the congregation to support and help our brothers when they make a false step. Now, did you notice here from Galatians how we are to help our brothers?